So starting with our next session, the last session I would like to say, I would like to invite our chairperson, Dr. Sudha Ganesh, co-chairperson, Dr. Shishir Naren, Dr. Devidas Das, co-convener, Dr. Banker Ale. Again, he is a co-convener. I would also like to invite our moderators, Dr. Murthy Someshaila, and also one more moderator, Dr. Partha Pratim Datta Mujimdar. So I request all the speakers and chairpersons to please unmute themselves and switch on the camera, and you can go ahead with the conversations. Over to the moderators. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tanvi. Tanvi, you could take a screenshot while we're all coming online.
Oh, definitely.
Yes,
How sweet of you.
because we're all part of the Uveitis Society of India as well. And
Yes.
we're all closely connected. So it would be nice.
It's honor to serve you all. I'm really very glad.
So we're just going to start the session and just tell you a few housekeeping, thank you, things that to start with. So I heard somebody say that about the attendees. So I believe that that's not a true reflection of the actual attendees. It's a different formatting that they use. It's a live streaming basically. So the attendees, if you see, it'll just say Q&A. So that's an attendee apparently. So let's not go with that. We don't know how many people are attending.
Also, Somshila is going to be recorded and I think it's going to be available.
That's right. Yeah, that's also.
That's where you're going to be all seeing other sessions and everything.
So all the national symposia are going on simultaneously. And if that wasn't enough competition, we also have the dance cultural program going on a little bit later. It's going to start maybe 1 hour later from now. So very quickly, we have really eminent speakers. Dr. JB has put together this session. I think it makes a lot of sense the way he's put it. My plan was very different, and this is a much better plan for the National Symposium with a focus on uveitis, on infectious uveitis. And we have all stalwarts in this field, excluding myself, of course. So the plan is to have a speaker take up 10 minutes, hopefully 8 to 10 minutes of the time, and put across important points based on whatever is the topic. And Partho and myself, we will ask comments from the chair, co-chair, convener and co-convener, not convener, and ask them to provide their comments. And in the end, though we have slotted 10 minutes as discussion time, it's the last session. And if you're interested, we can go a little bit late also in the end. And we'll take up, if we get audience questions, we take that up, or I'm sure we'll have our own questions, or we know the frequently asked questions from various people, so we'll take that up. All right. So we'll go first and start off straight away with none other than Dr. JB, who's put together the whole session. And he's going to talk about infectious uveitis, searching for the cause.
Share the screen. Share the screen. Just a minute.
So Tanvi is helping us keep time, and as you saw in the other sessions, they're very good with that.
Yes.
Yes, doctor. Yes. So we are giving 10 minutes timer. I hope I request all the speakers to please finish on time. Thank you so much.
Is my slide visible?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
So I just like to thank first the AIOC to give the uveitis slot for the National Symposium. This is very good. I'm going to start with this symposium of infectious uveitis with the search for the cause. I'll take exactly 9 minutes, 30 seconds. Infectious uveitis search for the cause. Prompt and precise clinical diagnosis is quite important in infectious uveitis. And etiological diagnosis should be made as soon as possible because it needs rapid action to combat the infectious agents and preserve the vision. I just want to share with you what I do. I go through the history and old records with the patient bringing meticulously. If that patient is history is quite important, and that we join with the clinical findings and the laboratory investigation. I try to find out the systemic disease, if any, history of fever, dengue, typhoid, rickettsia, chikungunya. Is the patient immunocompromised? HIV or systemic malignancy? History of unprotected sex? History of IV infusion in case of endogenous endophthalmitis. Sometimes contact with the pet history is quite useful, like Toxoplasma toxocara. These are 30-year-old female, immunocompetent, and you can see that there is a whitish exudate material in the vitreous cavity. If we look into the history, this patient gave history of hospitalization in the recent past and had IV infusion. And the vitreous biopsy showed endogenous endophthalmitis. So what we thought that is a kind of a vitritis can be, with the history itself, can help us to make a diagnosis. I also look at the patient as a whole, and like this patient who has got a necrotizing retinitis with hemorrhage, 30-year-old female, immunocompetent. And looking at the face itself, we can see that the vesicles were seen on over the forehead. And this is the herpes zoster vesicle, varicella zoster, and indeed the patient had varicella zoster viral retinitis. And after IV and acyclovir injection, there is a marked resolution of inflammation. So this is a 30-year-old male HIV positive patient, and you have seen the retinitis with subretinal deposits. Subretinal deposits. And in the hand, you can see that the lesions on the hand in the palm, and these lesions are syphilitic rashes. And this patient indeed had VDRL TPHA positive, and the patient has syphilitic positive uveitis. So simple clinical examinations of the whole in the patient helps us to make a diagnosis. Serology, are they useful? Yes, in some cases like HIV and syphilis, I depend on the serology. But in the toxoplasma, clinical diagnosis comes first, and then confirmation can be made by the toxoplasma ELISA serology. Post-fever retinitis serology is quite useful. Dengue, typhoid, rickettsia, chikungunya. These toxoplasmic retinochoroiditis often have classic appearance with the retinitis by the age of a scar, or a retinochoroiditis with headlight in the fog appearance with localized vitreous haze. I make the clinical diagnosis first, even start the therapy before serology results comes. If I do the ELISA test only, but in case of HIV positive patients, when there is a atypical necrotizing retinitis, I add, along with other investigation, a PCR for intraocular fluid for toxoplasma. Ocular syphilis is often a challenge. It can have mimic any type of uveitis. I do serological tests, both non-treponemal and treponemal. Non-treponemal test is for state of activity, and FTAVS and TPHA has had a high degree of sensitivity and specificity. This is a case of syphilitic posterior uveitis, and you can see the diagnosis can be made by both non-treponemal and treponemal test. And there is a marked resolution after intramuscular injection of penicillin. Tubercular uveitis, there is a big debate what should be done and what should not be done. It has got protein manifestation. Single test in my mind is not helpful. What I do, I make a clinical diagnosis first, like granulomatous anterior uveitis or multifocal serpiginoid choroiditis, where I suspect, or there is a broad posterior synechia, choroidal nodule, subretinal abscess. So I make my clinical diagnosis first, and based on that, I do the both Mantoux and quantiferon TB gold test, but both of them are supportive only to my clinical diagnosis. I do a HSCT test, particularly to rule out a TB and sarcoid. And then if negative, we do anterior chamber tap, vitreous aspiration, even go for fine needle aspiration biopsy of choroidal mass lesion in strong suspicion. Subject to the PCR for MTB genome, I do both nested and real time. Roll-up HSCT, we do the rule-out TB and sarcoid. This is an example, 14-year-old girl, bilateral intermediate uveitis. It could be TB or sarcoid, but HSCT test showed multiple nodules in the lung parenchyma, suggestive of tubercular etiology. Intraocular fluid study can often give the diagnosis, though it should be clinically correlated. Polymerase chain reaction sensitivity is around 80%, but specificity varies from 90 to 100% cases. This is a PCR machine, is that report is ready within 12 hours. This rapid results helps us quite a lot in infectious uveitis. This is a case of 21-year-old female with granulomatous anterior uveitis of Marfan-Fett KPs, broad posterior and peripheral anterior synechia. Laboratory test was not very confirmatory. I did go ahead with the anterior chamber tap, and then anterior chamber tap showed PCR for Mycobacterium tuberculosis, both MPV64 and IS6110 region positive. This is a case of subretinal abscess, and we suspected an infectious etiology. We take a fine needle aspiration biopsy, and this biopsy specimen was subjected for various organisms in the PCR test. FNAB specimen for PCR for MTB came positive. And then after the treatment with the anti-TB and steroid, the patient had complete resolution of inflammation with marked improvement of vision. Real-time PCR is an advancement in the PCR technique. Here you get the copy number of the amplified DNA. Fluorescent molecule is used to monitor the PCR reaction. I do the increase of viral anterior uveitis, clinical suspicion first, often very high IOP, pigmented KPs, ACTAP for PCR, HSV1 and 2, VZV, CMV I do, and both nested and real-time PCR I do it. So real-time PCR can be helpful in recurrent cytomegalovirus anterior uveitis, where the resolution of the treatment can be attained with the real-time PCR monitoring. This is a curve showing the real-time PCR positivity with the anterior chamber fluid. In case of viral retinitis, which could be acute retinal necrosis, herpetic necrotizing retinitis, CMV retinitis, and this ARN is often have a classic appearance like peripheral necrotizing retinitis with wedge-shaped appearance. To do that, to find out what virus is there, I do the AC tap when there is AC inflammation, or vitreous biopsy if no AC inflammation. I do both nested and real-time PCR for herpes viruses. And sometimes if there's a doubt in the diagnosis of necrotizing retinitis, I add toxoplasma also. This is a case of acute retinal necrosis. I can see the necrotizing retinitis in the periphery with retinal hemorrhages and wedge-shaped appearance. We did a nested PCR as well as the real-time PCR. Nested PCR showed HSV1 positive, and the real-time PCR showed 88,000 copies of the herpes simplex virus type 1. The outcome of the polymerase chain reactions, the analysis of 100 suspected cases of infectious uveitis confirmed or provided diagnosis in 70% of the cases. This is a case of a cytomegalovirus retinitis, which has got often a characteristic appearance. And I do that test for HIV and CD4 cell count and take history of HIV and organ transplantation. Post-fever retinitis serology is quite useful. Rickettsia, dengue, chikungunya, typhoid, and consultation by infectious disease specialist when there is other system or involvement. And PCR for chikungunya is quite helpful. This is a patient with 48-year-old male with history of fever 3 months back, multiple areas of retinal exudates with hemorrhage. We did the PCR for several organisms. 9 copies of chikungunya virus was found, and this with the treatment of steroid, there's a marked resolution of inflammation. Last but not the least is muscular syndrome, where biopsy is mandatory. We do the vitreous biopsy, and this specimen should reach the pathology lab within 30 minutes. And there is a necrotic background. You can see the abnormal lymphoma cells. In case of vitreous biopsy negative, we can do a fine needle aspiration biopsy. Here in necrotic background, we can see the large lymphoma cells. And CD20 is positive. Retinal or retinochoroidal biopsy is required in a very recalcitrant cases and when other diagnostic modalities fails. And this is a case of necrotizing retinitis, which you can say necrotic retina, Toxoplasma gondii organism. What's new is that in metagenomic deep sequencing, identify common and rare pathogens. And last but not the least, a new thing, MemoID 88L265 mutations, which can be seen in the primary intraocular lymph node. So take-home message is a good clinical history. Look at the picture as a whole, look at the patient as a whole, make a short clinical differential diagnosis, correlate with lab tests, take the help of infectious disease specialists in multi-system involvement, do invasive test, intraocular fluid or biopsy when in doubt or in strong suspicion, and don't miss endogenous endophthalmitis and masquerade syndrome. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir, for a wonderful talk, and it was right on time as you said you would be. So just a quick comment from Dr. Sudha Ganesh, if she has any comment. So both Dr. Sudha Ganesh and Dr. JB are from the same institute, and I'm pretty sure that they follow the same pattern. Dr. Sudha Ganesh is not here. So in that case, Ale, if you could chip in with your comments on what is your conventional way of working up patients for infectious uveitis, a very brief.
Yeah, because I am in private practice, which is very, very different from most of you guys who are in, institutes. And as Dr. Biswas said, in my practice scenario, I have to rely very heavily on my clinical diagnosis. Unfortunately, most of our patients are not willing to undergo these tests. They are not very convinced to go for even PCRs as commonly. Though with COVID, I'm sure everybody is now aware what PCR is. But other than that, we have a really tough time advising PCRs, particularly in viral retinitis or necrotic retinitis. Sometimes, as Dr. Biswas said, it's very difficult to rule out toxo and typical viral retinitis. And even after what we call as a therapeutic trial, they are non-responding. So I'm sure PCR is probably the only way to go. But being in private practice, these are some hurdles which we have to face.
Great. Thank you. I'll hand over to Partha to introduce the next speaker. And there is a question in the chat, so maybe Dr. JB or Alay can take it.
I think we can take that after the.
Yeah,
session.
certainly. Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Someshila. Actually, we are running out of time, so I request you to please wrap
Our
up.
next speaker is Professor Vishali Gupta. She is from PGI Chandigarh, and she is our president of Uveitis Society of India. So she will be speaking on tubercular uveitis continued challenge. Ma'am, over to you.
Thank you. Am I unmuted?
Yes, we can hear you. The
Thank
slides are also there.
The topic Dr. Biswas has given me is the continued challenge. I said before we talk about the continues, let's just see what are the challenges which we have kind of overcome. The first challenge, when Dr. Biswas actually gave us the histopathologic features of the eyes that had to be enucleated, we did not even know what were the clinical manifestations. That seems so easy today. So over a period of time, we have overcome this challenge, and now with confidence, we can say that if you see mutton fat capies, granulomatous topes, Bisacchus nodules, and of course the broad-based posterior synecdoche, you can be quite sure that the diagnosis can likely be tuberculosis. In the intermediate uveitis, to me, very important sign is that you are seeing these large snowballs, but they don't form a bank. And I don't know why it happens, but this is something which is a very important diagnostic sign for tuberculosis. Chronicity, large snow banks, no typical banking. Occlusive form of the retinal vasculitis, which may or may not be associated with these perivascular choroiditis patches, is a very important. And if you happen to see these patches in the same eye or in the opposite eye, again, a very important clinical marker towards possible TB formation. And of course, these are the signs which everybody knew it: tubercles, large abscess, and tuberculomas. And if you see, please look for associated systemic disease. Serpiginous choroiditis was something we are proud to be describing for the first time in late 90s, and this was generally unilateral, associated with may have inflammation, multifocal, posterior pole, and you will have the healing in the center and progression along the edge. So these are some of the signs that we talked about, that if you have the vasculitis with choroiditis patch or serpiginous-like choroiditis, these are the ones which have a very strong phenotypic characterization that it's likely to be TB. The challenge second, which still remains, is how would you investigate, and Dr. Biswas has already told us all about it, that you are looking both from the inflammation as well as the infective point of view. So let's look at what the experts are doing in the real life, because right now we had a discussion on the PCR availability. So when we collected data for COTS from the real life from 25 countries across the world, we realized that more than 90% of the patients do not have systemic evidence of tuberculosis, which is very important. Don't go crazy looking for the active systemic disease, because it's not going to be there. in 92% of the patients exactly. Montius was positive in 87 and TB Gold was positive in 89. Most performed tests were actually these two. PCR was not very commonly performed, or even when it was performed, unlike Dr. Biswas, majority of the people, the report came very late, and by that time it had lost its validity because many of them had already started anti-TB trial. CT chest was found to be much better than chest X-ray for detecting cold exposure to TB. So coming to next challenge is what should be the criteria for initiating TB treatment, and we have kind of made permutations and combinations and gathered the experts again from all over the world to come on the consensus. And I'm just going to summarize a little bit here. If you have a phenotype, as I explained earlier, serpiginous-like choroiditis, which is very, very typical for tuberculosis, the experts would treat it either of the combinations, like two immunological, which is Motius and quantiferon, and one radiology positive, one immunology, one radiology positive, just one immunological test also positive. So they are likely to treat only this phenotype of tuberculosis. The other phenotypes where we are not very sure about the tuberculosis association or where the response, as per the reported literature, has not been too good, the experts were more conservative. Like anterior uveitis, majority would treat only if it is recurrent and if at least two or preferably all the three tests were positive. And same for intermediate uveitis. This is the dilemma, like you have done surgery vitrectomy for Eales disease and you find these scars, should you treat? No. Inactive vasculitis doesn't need to be treated. However, if it is active, but it is occlusive and you have to three tests or at least two positive, you can treat it. For more details, both the reports of the consensus have been published in Ophthalmology Journal. Coming to the fourth challenge, which comes time and again, is why corticosteroids? Should you give? Should you not give? When do you give? When do you taper? So I think the most important thing is to understand the phenotype. There is the type of the phenotype where there is active infection, and there are the type of phenotypes like serpiginous-like choroiditis, where there is inflammation. So if you have a phenotype like this, for example, you see a large granuloma, it's just an abscess out there. So then it does not mean that TB needs steroids, not this kind of phenotype. And especially when you are deciding to give, never ever think of giving local steroids, because this is the patient who actually received an Ozurdex implant. So whenever in doubt, whenever, even if you want to give, don't inject intravitreal implants because it's not easy to take them out. So see this patient who had received an implant and then he came with the multiplication of the bacilli on him. So these are the kind of the phenotypes which do not need steroids. Now, on the other hand, we have the phenotype which is an immune-mediated response to TB, like serpiginous-like choroiditis. So what will happen if you don't give adequate steroids? So the thing which is going to happen is, this is baseline, you add anti-TB, either you don't give steroids or you are reluctant, like we add what I call homeopathic dose of steroids, 30 milligram, 40 milligram in a 70 kg old person. So there is going to be paradoxical worsening, which can happen in up to 40% of the patients. So if there is paradoxical worsening, you lose quite an amount of the benefit of adding ATT. So these are the kind of the patients where you should treat them with corticosteroids. So we did have consensus for concomitant use of corticosteroids by Cox consensus. The experts agreed that to prevent paradoxical worsening after initiating of ATT, systemic corticosteroids may be initiated. in patients who are unable to wean off the corticosteroids or in whom the disease progresses despite the initiation of ATT, you can add corticosteroid sparing immunosuppression. Intravitreal, I'm personally using a lot now that I have confidence that it is immune mediated phenotype like serpiginous choroiditis, but experts did not reach any consensus on intravitreal injection, either steroids or methotrexate. Just hold on here. To conclude, TB has protein manifestations in the eye, and most of the time, the patients will not have any active concomitant pulmonary disease. It is needed, ATT is required to treat active eye disease because you are aiming to reduce the recurrences. But since most of the phenotypes are immune mediated, so your long-term goal is to reduce the recurrence, but the short-term goal is to protect the eye from the effect of inflammation as well. And for that, you may have to use corticosteroids, but just rule out the presence of large tubercular abscess and granulomas, where you may have to restrain some caution rather than going full dose of corticosteroids. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, ma'am. That was very illuminating. So we'll move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Dr. Somshila Murthy. She will be speaking on viral anterior uveitis. Are we seeing it more? Over to you, Dr. Murthy.
Thank you very much, Partha. Coming after Dr. Vishali, it's a tough act to follow, but the topic that Dr. JB gave me, and I find it very interesting, is that he's asked me to look at the question, are we seeing more of viral anterior uveitis? So viral anterior uveitis is defined as a sort of a low-grade anterior uveitis most of the time, where the intraocular pressure is elevated. So there are 3 or 4 ways in which it might manifest. So you can have diffuse stellate keratic precipitates, or you can have pigmentation within active keratic precipitates with iris atrophic changes, sometimes very high pressures and very episodic. So like the Posler-Schwarzman kind of presentation. So you can have it in elderly patients or in young individuals as well. So it does have a lot of clinical variation in terms of the pattern. And the causes, herpetic is of course the commonest cause. In fact, 5 to 10% of all the cases that were attributed to infection etiology in anterior uveitis was about due to herpetic. And in Indian scenario, it's about 0.9 to 8.3%. And this is from the excellent article published by Kalpana. So when I was trying to look at the epidemiology across the years and the more recently published articles, so what I saw that it didn't, at least what is published has not really changed much. It seems to vary from about 7 to 9 to 10% based on whichever study you go to. And a few of the Western studies actually had a slightly lower percentage. For example, this one, which was a large population in Sweden, it had about a 5.1%, but they only look at HSV and VZV. Whereas the other publications, which were from China as well as from India and Southeast Asia, so they had definitely a higher percentage of viral infection for the anterior uveitis component. So are we seeing it more, or rather probably we are diagnosing it more because we're recognizing it more? The background is, why does this uveitis become so recalcitrant? Is that the eye, of course, is a natural reservoir for viruses which remain dormant for a long time. And there are recurrent episodes which can occur. In spite of treating the patient for 3-6 months of antiviral therapy, you can still have recurrent episodes which can happen for years, because there's so much of variability, as I mentioned, there's so much of variability in the host in terms of age, prior disease, whether the antibodies which are there, could they neutralize the virus, or the cytopathic effect of the virus itself vis-a-vis the immune mechanism of the host. So that's the reason of the variability. Now, what are the common viruses causing this? You have VZV, CMV, rubella virus, but there are also certain rare viruses that are there. And these, it's really hard to detect these viruses, even with most of PCR testing, whatever you do, unless we actually suspect this, or let's say we have a patient with history of chikungunya or dengue fever, and then we might suspect this as the cause. So coming to what you can commonly see in your clinic is these top 3 kind of viruses, which is herpes simplex, varicella zoster, and cytomegalovirus. So very quickly running through the clinical features. In the case of herpes simplex, you'll have a patient coming in maybe with some recurrent keratitis. There may be previous corneal scars. The corneal sensation may be reduced. You might be lucky to see the typical form of the keratitis, like the dendrites and so on. They would have small to medium to sometimes even large KPs and moderate AC reaction with raised intraocular pressure. So this is typically what you would expect with HSV. On the other hand, in case of zoster, you might have a patient with immunocompromised status with 8ZO accompanying the onset of the disease and various other corneal manifestations. There would be quite a profound AC reaction. There would be segmental iris atrophy, translumination defects, and the classical skin depigmentary changes. So sometimes it's easier to recognize a zoster kind of a anterior uveitis. So CMV is a more recent entity, and I'm very fascinated by it always in the way it causes localized corneal edema. So it affects both the endothelial cells as well as uveitis, as well as causing secondary glaucoma. And this can be, the classic is coin-shaped kind of pattern, but we don't see it all the time. We might see it linear or granulomatous kind of inflammation, which is not respecting the Arles triangle, but can be there just in the center somewhere. And raised IOP, super raised IOP in 40s, 60s is quite classical with this, which is transient, and the specular counts slowly get affected. So this is what you can see with CMV. And of course, the last entity is Fuchs, which we know is a white eye uveitis, classic stellate keratic precipitates without posterior signing K. Patient comes in with cataract most of the time, and vitreous opacities also, and you can have the classical iris hyperchromia. And there is an association with rubella virus. So I'm going to quickly run through a few cases, and these are very interesting to me at least. So the first case is a 38-year-old lady. She has a 16-year history of chronic recurrent low-grade uveitis, and she was investigated for everything that could cause anterior segment inflammation, and systemically at least, and also she had developed secondary glaucoma. So because of the chronic recurrent history, when she came to us, what we could see is that the patient had already undergone cataract surgery. You could see these fairly large keratic precipitate, and the diffuse look is because of corneal edema, and she had undergone LASIK. So what you could see is the interface fluid following LASIK surgery because of the raised pressure and the corneal edema. So we did an AC tap for her with, and what we got with real-time quantitative PCR was very high viral load of CMV. So we started the patient on oral vanganciclovir. Within a couple of weeks, she got much, much better. She had to undergo a trab for her secondary glaucoma because it was advanced. So this specular shows how bad the endothelium looked at entry. And later on down the line, it stabilized. She still has not a great endothelial cell count, but her corneas look much, much clearer. So we published this report. The second case was an interesting 61-year-old gentleman who had recurrent uveitis for about 3 to 4 years. But by the time he came to us, he's also developing corneal edema. He had secondary glaucoma. So this kind of picture where you have uveitis with with these keratic precipitates and corneal edema, I think to me is quite classical for a viral etiology. So interestingly, this patient was HLA-B27 positive, and that threw everybody off the track. And the patient was almost going to be started on antimetabolites and then was going to go on to biologicals because his inflammation wouldn't subside. This was the entry level showing the corneal edema and this corrugation on the folds in the Descemet's membrane, and even some keratic precipitates which are isolated and hanging there on the DM. And this is his affected eye, which shows that the specular count is compromised. So he also had to undergo trabeculectomy for his glaucoma, which is pretty advanced, as well as cataract surgery, which was initially had a lot of corneal edema, which recovered, and he recovered complete vision. So we published this as a case, how it can mimic, and especially if you have HLA-B27 uveitis, you think it's that. This was one more interesting case. Now, when I think back, I think I've seen other such patients, a 5-year-old child who presented to us because it was 2-3 month history with hypopion, not responding to everything, to steroids and so on. So in fact, when the child came, it was one of the differentials was a masquerade. So the child underwent a biopsy, and the hypopion itself was sent, which actually showed granulomatous inflammation and multinucleated giant cells with ribbon-like folds. So we thought that, so this is the giant cell with the ribbon-like nuclear membrane folds. So we thought that we also sent the aqueous for quantitative PCR, and that came back as HSV1. And the child improved dramatically after we started antivirals. Of course, due to the chronic inflammation, child had a cataract, we had to do cataract surgery as well for this patient. So this was also published. And coming to a couple of other cases, if I have time, not able to see the timer.
You can take one more minute.
Right. So just with last two cases. So this patient is interesting in that he's antidiuretic since 4 years, secondary glaucoma on brimonidine and other drugs since 2 years. Also extensively investigated. They're all negative. So we shouldn't jump to the conclusion that they're all viral. We must investigate them for recurrent antiuveitis, HLA-B27 and so on. Those should be done. So ACTAP was negative though in this case. So what did we do? So we still went ahead and started the patient on oral acyclovir. There was significant improvement in the sense that his recurrent episodes stopped, his pressures became normal. We could stop AGMs, stop prednisolone, though he's on low dose drugs. So this was a patient with these very fine pigments which are dispersed on the endothelium. The last case I have was an interesting patient who first came to us in November 2018. And by the time he already had the disease for quite some time, he had advanced secondary glaucoma with a 0.8 cup. So because he had recurrent episodes with high pressures, so we decided to start oral acyclovir a few months later, but he didn't really improve. Even his glaucoma kept progressing, so he required TRAB and a cataract surgery. So this was after the cataract surgery and TRAB, though his cornea looked a little better, but he kept having these recurrent episodes of inflammation. And you can notice how the diffuse corneal edema inferiorly now is showing up as keratic precipitates. Something is attacking the endothelium. So when he got lost due to COVID, came back after that, and then we did an ACTAP, which was surprisingly positive both for HSV1 as well as for CMV. So we treated him now with acyclovir, and his speculars were, of course, by the time his corneal endothelium had suffered a lot, and he also underwent DSEC subsequently. So that's all I had to share with you about the increased number of viral anterior uveitis we're seeing. Maybe it's just that we're becoming a little smarter.
Wow, that was an excellent overview of viral diseases. I have a quick question. I'll go to Professor Gupta. I think it will help our audience also to understand. Madam, do you rely on serological tests while treating a case of viral uveitis?
Not really. I rely more on my clinical judgment than serology.
Yeah, when I said serology, I meant for other entities, not for viral. Serology for viral is
I
not.
mean, if it comes positive, I feel very happy because it kind of adds to my clinical.
Right.
But if it's negative, I really don't pay attention. If it's like Dr. Don Gass, I kind of trained with him. He says, if it walks like a duck, talks like a duck, got to be duck.
Yes.
And so I would go the same way for viral.
Excellent. Very practical tip, Dr. Vishali. We'll move on to the next speaker. So it's my.
Can I have a short question?
Yes, Debashish.
How long we will continue with the systemic antivirals?
So typically, most of us, I think we would use it for 3 months if it's valacyclovir, if it's ganciclovir, mainly because of the cost. But acyclovir, I would use it much longer.
Much longer means?
It's at least 6 months.
6 months.
Because
and what are the chances of recurrences?
Yeah, so maybe 50% patients do have mild recurrences, which you can manage with topical.
And in that case, shall we again restart the antivirals for?
So, based on the recurrence, we can manage with topical ganciclovir gel or other milder forms. But if it doesn't work and serially endothelial cell counts are going down, then I once again start the treatment. So thanks for asking that. In the interest of time, we go to our next very exciting talk. Bala is going to speak. Bala is a consultant, very interesting fellow from Arvind Eye Hospital from Pondicherry. Bala, all yours.
Good evening, madam. I thank AOS for giving me this wonderful opportunity to present my topic on the return of the great masquerader, syphilis. So I should start my case, my presentation with the case. This was a 20-year-old male resident from a nearby town and presented with redness in 3 days associated with sudden onset of pain and defective vision of 1 week duration. He had history of chickenpox at the age of 5 years. There was nothing relevant in the personal or social or economic or systemic history. He denied initially any history of exposure. On general examination, he was well built, nourished, but if you carefully examine, there were subtle hyperpigmented lesions on the hand which were really suspicious for us, as Dr. JB said in his talk. The vitals was normal, and he had consulted another hospital he showed the records where he was treated with oral steroids, topical antibiotics, cycloplegics, and interestingly, the periocular steroid was also given for the diagnosis of right eye vitritis written in the discharge summary. And he said that the pain redness reduced, but the defective vision continued to persist. On examination, his vision in the right eye was 6/60, the other eye was normal. Right eye had minimal congestion with cells and posterior synechiae. The vitritis of grade 3 and the fundus showed discrete yellowish fluffy lesions superior temporally and few scleroid vessels and snowball-like clumping were seen. The media was a little hazy and my camera couldn't capture those peripheral lesions, but the OCT still showed some vitreous inflammation as well. And we had a working diagnosis of pan-uveitis and a set of differential diagnoses because of the peripheral retinitis-like lesion, cori-ARN, or could be toxoplasma, tuberculosis, or syphilis. So we thought that tuberculosis is less likely because MAN2 and workup was negative, and the toxo report was still not available, and we still had other differentials in mind. So started the patient on antivirals and as well as azithromycin and the topical treatment, and the vision worsened with 5/60, and the reports came after a few days with the report of HIV being positive and TPHA also being positive. We were really surprised because he initially denied, and repeated probing, he said there was history of exposure. So we correlated the general examination findings, and the FTA base is also positive. And so we thought that we were dealing with a case of syphilis where periocular steroid actually wasn't the problem. So we discussed with the internist and started the penicillin treatment and followed up, and the fundus showed minimal sheathing and improving vitritis. Surprisingly, the vision improved to 6/6, which was really a surprise for us. So it is well said that he who knows syphilis knows general medicine, William Osler said. So interestingly, Pondicherry, this patient was dealing with a French disease, and the motile spiral gram-negative bacteria couldn't survive in the animal host and cannot be cultured. And we have different form of syphilis: congenital in the first 2 years, and the late syphilis. Acquired could be early and late, primary, secondary, and early latent. The late, there could be a neurological, cardiovascular, and gummatous lesions in the late presentation. The primary syphilis, we could have even a conjunctival chancre, could involve the orbits as eyelid rash, periostitis, dacrocystitis, dacroadenitis, and madarosis. The secondary syphilis, where we have the uveitis manifestation with chorioretinitis, neuroretinitis, retinal vasculitis, and even APMPP-like picture. In addition, we should also look for the neuro-ophthalmic involvement as cranial nerve palsies, RAPDs with optic neuritis. The conjunctivitis, interstitial keratitis, episcleritis, scleritis, antiuveitis should not be overlooked. No structure of the eye is immune from the manifestation of the syphilis. The tertiary syphilis could take on the form of neuro-ophthalmic Argyll-Robertson pupil, tonic pupil, Horner syndrome, optic atrophy, palsies, nystagmus, and field defects, as well as the gammas. So we did a literature search, and this article by Janet Davis was really interesting and relevant to our case, because it has been mentioned that syphilis is rarely a necrotizing retinitis unless it is pre-treated with periocular or intraocular steroid, like that has happened in our case. So the presentation could mimic an ARN, like mentioned in this case report, and it responds brilliantly well if you pick up early with appropriate treatment, like this case which had a recovery to 6/6. Treatment in penicillin is the most effective treatment, which we all know. We should not be inclined to give an alternate equivalent regimen because the efficacy, the intraocular MIC concentration are not great enough. The equivalent regimen, and the prevalence of syphilis has increased several times in the recent years, and that's why we call it as a recrudescence of the whole disease. So syphilis can, panuveitis can mimic ARN. There are multiple reports. Here there was a placoid lesion and panuveitis, and mistreated as ARN, and finally syphilis was picked up. So similarly, syphilitic retinitis and uveitis in HIV positive, we need to be very careful in starting the treatment for HIV as well. So the diagnosis depends on direct inoculation, direct detection, non-treponemal test, as well as the specific test. So fluorescent treponemal antibody has got a high degree of specificity, and there are two ways to diagnose. One is a traditional approach where we start with a non-treponemal test, and if it is negative, we don't pursue further, whereas if it is positive, go and proceed with the treponemal test, that is TPHA or TPPA and FTABS. So in the reverse mode, which is being mentioned by Dr. Janet Davis, where the treponemal immunoassays, the specific tests were done first and followed by a non-treponemal test. So the reverse sequencing, it has an enhanced sensitivity for detecting patients with late syphilis. So coming to our case, what went wrong in our case was the treating doctor has really applied a Kaplan's algorithm for treatment of intermediate uveitis. It says that for the step 1 of intermediate uveitis, start with periocular steroids. Foster interestingly modified by adding systemic steroids between step 1 and 2, but in our case, we did not do a CSF analysis and PCR to prove it is syphilis. Whereas the current guideline of intermediate uveitis starts with oral and periocular immunosuppressive and biologicals. We don't initially embark on periocular steroids. So in our case, we did treat with penicillin, and there are other equivalent regimens like procaine penicillin, benzathine penicillin of different dosage. Why this case? Because IVTA can make the syphilis into a necrotizing form. That is the uniqueness of this case. Co-infection of syphilis in HIV is on the rise. This emphasizes that we need to be really careful not to miss the diagnostic evaluation of syphilis with the specific and the non-specific test. One needs to have a high degree of suspicion to arrive at the correct diagnosis and institute prompt therapy. And the take-home message is specific etiology really matters. Syphilis is still an important differential. And some people used to say, like, why are you doing syphilis test when the yield is very less? You see one patient in 3 to 6 months. But we should be very careful not to miss it. Blindly following the protocol of intermediate uveitis has to be revisited. Think before we prick intermediate uveitis. Thank you so much.
Excellent talk, Partho, excellent talk, Bala, as usual. Once again, we'll move on to the next session, unless there's any quick comment from either Ale or Debashish or Shishir. Can we have the next speaker, Dr. Padmamalini Mahendradas? She's a uveitis boss from Narayanachalia.
I will like to quote a small thing. In one of the meetings a few years back, Dr. Ratnam ma'am said that you should always get a VDRL done in every patient of uveitis. Even if you get a single patient positive, it will be worth it to have tested this all throughout your career. And I recently had this case where the patient came out to be TPHA positive and then HIV positive. So I think that makes a lot of, it's very important to do VDRL or TPHA in every case of uveitis, at least in modern practice.
Totally agreed. We'll bring this up in the discussion. Can we reset the timer, please? Reset the timer to 10. Thank you. Padma, over to you. Looking forward. Padma, are you speaking? Your slides are up.
She's muted.
Padma, yeah,
That's fine.
She's getting there.
Thank you, Dr. Somashila. Good evening to all of you. And outside, I to thank AOS Scientific Committee.
So maybe Padma, you can keep your video off, and because otherwise we're not.
For giving
The voice is breaking.
opportunity.
So you can keep your video off.
Yeah, tonight this.
So Padma, you can keep your video off.
Okay. Video is off only.
Already off, ma'am.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead, Padma, please.
It's an infectious or para-infectious uveitic entity. Most of the times, this patient presents with history of fever associated with systemic symptoms such as joint pain and skin rash in the past. But most of the time, they don't reveal this history. Most of the entities, they mimic morphologically same. It's very difficult to pinpoint the exact etiology based on the clinical presentation. Serological investigations and molecular diagnostics such as PCR and the current knowledge of what is epidemic and recent pandemic in the community may help us to identify the etiological organism. The various spectrum, patients can present in the form of cotton wool spots in the retina or retinal hemorrhages associated with retinitis, neuroretinitis, macular star, retinitis with vascular occlusion or occlusive vasculitis. These are the various presentations post-fever retinitis cases can have. Recently, we have described ring retinitis as a morphological description of retinitis in post-fever cases. Recently, we have published a review article on post-fever retinitis with newer concepts in Indian Journal of Ophthalmology, which covers most of the commonly described post-fever retinitis cases such as typhoid rickettsiosis. They are secondary to bacterial infection. Arboviral infections are West Nile, dengue, chikungunya, and also we have covered Ebola and Zika retinitis cases. Recently, due to the COVID pandemic, SARS-2 COVID virus also can cause retinitis. Here is a case of a typhoid retinitis in a 34-year male where you could see multiple retinitis patches with vasculitis lesions, posterior vitreous cells with hyperreflectivity in the inner retinal layers. FFA shows staining and leakage from the retinal vessels because the Salmonella typhi has a trophism towards the endothelial cells. These typhoid cases, the diagnosis are made by the typhoid or Vidal test, PCR, or with the blood culture. So these patients are treated with oral antibiotics with Next, we'll move on to rickettsial disease. Rickettsial diseases, they can have triad of high-grade fever, headache, and skin rashes, or sometimes black spot at the site of the arthropod bite called stachanoia. Ocular involvement is common. Most of the cases are asymptomatic and they are self-limited course. There are three types. It could be a spotted fever, typhus fever, or scrub typhus. They are diagnosed commonly with the help of the Will-Felix test. However, immunofluorescence is the gold standard to diagnose. PCR and also rapid immunochromatographic test assay can help us to confirm the diagnosis of rickettsial infection. Common presentation is a white retinal lesions along the retinal vessels associated with vitritis. Sometimes subclinical involvement can be picked up by angiogram. These patients responded well to doxycycline or fluoroquinolone group of antibiotics. And if vision-threatening lesions, then we add corticosteroids in these cases. Here is a case of a 32-year female as a case of multiple whitish lesions in fundus, along with there is a block fluorescence that is sclerosed vessels in the eye. This responded well to doxy and systemic steroids. This occurs due to the immune-mediated phenomena in a series. Next, we'll move on to the West Nile disease. Single strand RNA virus. Here again, headache, myalgia, and severe cases can have meningoencephalitis. Bilateral multiple chorioretinitis is a classical presentation. Diabetes mellitus appears to be a risk factor for development of severe neurological disease. They have severe chorioretinitis. Here again, the diagnosis by the demonstration of antibody by ELISA method or by RT-PCR from the ocular fluid or from the blood, confirming the diagnosis of West Nile infection. No proven treatment is available. However, the newer drugs like interferons and intravenous IgG have been tried in these cases. Ocular therapy with topical and systemic anti-inflammatory agents have been used to control the inflammation. Here is a 58-year-old diabetic where you could see classically the lesions are partial atrophic and partially pigmented, distributed along the nerve fiber layer of the retina. So this has been described by Monsif Kairala et al., where they've showed linear tracks along the nerve fiber layer of the retina. Dr. Rathinam et al. Have published neuroretinitis with vascular occlusions. They did not respect the nerve fiber distribution pattern in our South Indian cohorts of patients. The case of a 62-year diabetic who had vecinal extensive retinal hemorrhages with arterial sheathing in vecinal vasculitis case. Next, we'll move on to dengue uveitis. Dengue is caused by the dengue virus, is a flavivirus. Here, patients are mostly present with thrombocytopenia, can have bleeding manifestations in acute presentation. Severe cases can have hypertension and dengue hemorrhagic shock syndrome. Common posterior segment manifestations are retinitis, retinal hemorrhages, vitreous hemorrhage, vascular occlusions, foveolitis, and dengue-induced inflammatory ischemic foveolitis and outer maculopathy also have been described. Diagnosis based on the presentation, serological titer, PCR, and serial platelet measurements can show the thrombocytic pattern in case of dengue infection. Most of the times, this is self-limiting course. However, immunosuppressions with topical, periocular, or systemic steroids help to control the inflammation in these cases. Here is a case of a bilateral multifocal retinitis with vasculitis secondary to dengue infection treated with systemic steroids. OCT shows hyperreflectivity after shadowing. This is a classical pattern of forced fever retinitis OCT pattern associated with hyperreflective dots in the posterior vitreous cavity. Following, we could see the systemic steroids resolving retinitis in this case. Here is a case of a dengue foveolitis showing a grayish reflex, and we can see the well-defined hyperreflective lesions underneath the fovea. This is a classical pattern in a case of a foveolitis, and this particular patient again responded well to systemic steroids. Next, we'll move on to chikungunya. It's a single-stranded RNA virus. Disease spread by the bite of Aedes group of mosquitoes. Ophthalmic manifestations can present at the time of fever after resolution of the disease. Retinitis, neuroretinitis, panuveitis, and vascular occlusions and few cases of exudative retinal detachment have been reported in association with chikungunya infection. Here again, diagnosis by the serological titer and also the RT-PCR for chikungunya virus from the eye, and these patients have been managed with supportive anti-inflammatory therapy. This is a case of chikungunya retinitis we have reported way back in 2007, and it is a case of a chikungunya retinitis. FFA shows early hypo with late hyperfluorescence. OCT shows hyperreflectivity after shadowing effect. Following systemic steroids, we could see the resolved retinitis with thinning of the nerve fiber layer of the retina in this case. Next, we'll move on to Ebola virus. Ebola causes hemorrhagic fever. Outbreak was reported in 2014. In many different types of uveitis can have anterior and also the multiple chorioretinal scars in the posterior segment have been described, and also the isolation of Ebola virus from the ocular fluid have been reported. Here, patients can have transaminitis through the mucous membranes and the body fluids have been reported. Favipiravir and anti-monoclonal antibodies have been tried for management of Ebola virus infection. Next, we'll move on to the Zika virus. It's a flavivirus. It causes microcephaly, and macular pigment and mottling in the retina is a characteristic feature. Here again, plaque reduction neutralization in addition to serological antibody and PCR reaction is used to diagnose this infection. Here we could see the multiple pigmentations with chorioretinal atrophic scars in the macula in a case of a Zika virus infection. Here again, healed with hypo and hyperautofluorescence in a case of a Zika uveitis case. With the history of eye pain and loss of infection. Following history of fever, on systemic evaluation, she had erythema multiforme skin lesions, and fundus examination showed retinitis with retinal hemorrhages with vascular occlusion. Here again, retinitis with combined artery and vein occlusion. OCT shows hyperreflectivity with after shadowing in both eyes. FFA ICG shows hypofluorescent spots corresponding to the areas of retinitis and retinal hemorrhages with sluggish circulations in the sclerotemporal vessels and also in the left eye, infranasal, both artery and the vein are affected with macular hypoperfusion as depicted in the form of hypofluorescence in this angiogram.
Can you sum up, Padma? We are out of
Patient had
time.
increased D-dimer level. In addition to the
Padma, can you sum up? Because we are out of time.
enoxaparin responded well to treatment. This case has been accepted for publication in Ocular Immunology and Inflammation. Post-fever retinitis as a seasonal variation, peak incidence in November to March in every year. And even though they have aggressive presentation, solution is there.
So, Dr.
Cases are
Padma,
treated with
can you sum up?
antibiotics. Yes.
Can you sum up because we're out of
Yes.
time?
Yeah. Arboviral diseases are managed with steroids. Steroids and anti-VEGF agents do not have any additional added benefit in reducing the macular edema in a case of a post-fever retinitis, which you have reported recently. And coming to post-COVID-19 retinitis, we need to check whether the patient has occurred secondary to infections, inflammatory, or hypercoagulable state. Depending on that, we need to manage this patient. I would like to acknowledge my colleagues for the contribution. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Padma. I think unfortunately we had some connectivity issues. We couldn't hear you in between for several moments. And in the interest of time, we'll go on to the next talk. That's by Dr. Kalpana Babamurthy. She's going to speak on viral retinitis, the real emergency. Dr. Kalpana is a very accomplished uveitis specialist from Bangalore.
Okay. Are my screens visible now?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, and I'm audible, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So at the outset, I would like to thank the All India Ophthalmic Society for this invitation. Viral retinitis is definitely an ophthalmic emergency, as it is associated with a high rate of visual morbidity. The viruses which are usually implicated in viral retinitis belong to the herpes viridae group. And these are viruses which remain latent in our body. And when there is a decreased cell-mediated immunity, it causes reactivation and the clinical disease. The host immunity plays an important role in the type of presentation which we see. Now, as we had learned from the earlier speakers, viral retinitis is definitely a clinical diagnosis, and there are a lot of important clues which will suggest that. So, for example, you have a pattern of retinitis, and then if it is associated with pigmented keratic precipitates, which are distributed across the corneal endothelium, and if there is an increased intraocular pressure, this is usually suggestive of a viral infection. So let's look at the pattern recognition. So the first pattern, which is very important, is the acute retinal necrosis. Now, the way we define this pattern is there are one or more foci of retinal necrosis in the peripheral retina, and there is rapid progression in the absence of treatment with the circumferential spread. Sometimes it can be associated with hemorrhages at the borders and very limited hemorrhages. And then you can see this occlusive vasculopathy. And this whole pattern is associated with increased inflammation in the vitreous and the anterior chamber. Now, this can also co-present with optic nerve involvement and scleritis. However, sometimes you can have just the disc edema presenting initially, as in this case, with some amount of serous fluid. And this was mistakenly thought as VKH, and this patient was started on oral steroids. But this patient actually had acute retinal necrosis, which started unfolding over the next couple of days. And this is a fluorescent angiography pattern showing the areas, large areas of necrosis with vasculopathy. Now, acute retinal necrosis is most commonly caused by the herpes simplex and the varicella zoster virus. But there are reports of cytomegalovirus also causing ARN in HIV. The traditional hallmark is immunocompetence, but these are patients which have some amount of subclinical immune dysfunction. So when you look at the history, they usually have a history of herpetic disease. They could have malignancy, they could have systemic comorbidities like diabetes, multi-drug resistant TB, etc., where the CMI is affected. And it could be iatrogenic immune suppression in the form of systemic immunosuppressives, biologics, or even local steroids. So how do we treat these patients? These patients are usually treated with systemic medications, most importantly. And this is very important because this is to prevent the involvement of the other eye and CNS-associated complications. And the drugs which are used are intravenous acyclovir or oral valcyclovir. Adjunctive therapy includes intravitreal injections of ganciclovir. And we also give oral steroids under this antiviral cover, especially when there is significant inflammation and if there is optic nerve involvement. We need to monitor these patients very closely for retinal breaks, as they can lead to retinal detachments, which can result in poor prognosis. The second most important pattern is the progressive outer retinal necrosis. And this is characterized by multifocal deep retinal opacification. They don't have any demarcations, so they are very confluent. And usually there is no vascular inflammation, or there is none or minimal intraocular inflammation. The most important finding is this perivenular lucency, or what we call as the cracked mud appearance. Now, this is usually seen when there is very severe immune suppression. So this is on the other end of the spectrum. And the most common disease which is associated with this is HIV. Majority cases of PORN is usually caused by the varicella zoster virus. And the goal of treatment will be to the antiviral therapy, which should be aggressive. And at the same time, you need to correct the underlying immunodeficiency. So the treatment is usually by intravenous ganciclovir, along with adjunctive intravitreal ganciclovir or foscarnet. There are reports of suprathreshold therapies of intravenous acyclovir also given, but these have a lot of renal complications. By and large, the prognosis is quite poor in these cases. Now, this is another case of which looked like a progressive outer retinal necrosis, but this was caused by the mumps virus. And this patient, again, the retinal edema improved, but had so much of outer retinal atrophy, unrecordable ERGs, and she has just perception of light. And this is a 9-year-old girl. The third pattern which we see, which we should recognize, is what we call as the pizza pie or the tomato ketchup appearance, or the brush fire pattern, which is very typical of the CMV retinitis. And this is a hemorrhagic component. It may be associated with optic atrophy with sclerosed vessels, and it can also be associated with this kind of frosted branch gingivitis. So basically, it is seen when the CD4 counts are very low, less than 100. And apart from HIV, you also see CMV retinitis post-transplants with biologics in malignancies, and now more commonly, local steroid injections. This is a patient and the imaging characteristics of CMV retinitis. Now, when you see a pattern like this, which is so bizarre with a lot of hemorrhagic component in this patient with CMV retinitis, always look for hematological parameters. So look for any hematological abnormalities, because this is quite common when you have hematological abnormalities. So this patient had severe anemia and actually failed the first line of antiretroviral therapy. This was actually a child. In the era of heart, now we are seeing more of immune recovery uveitis, and that could be mild to moderate or very severe like this. And pay attention to this vasculopathy, the occlusive vasculopathy, which you see. And this is usually not so common if you have treated these patients with systemic antiviral therapy. This is very important because this can cause ischemia and then neovascularization. This is another severe case, again, immune recovery uveitis, and this is what we see as bilateral arthritis. These cases progress very fast to neovascularization, vitreous hemorrhage, and you can even lose the eye. So these cases need to be extensively lasered initially itself, and they always need to be on maintenance of ganciclovir therapy. As the CMV retinitis in HIV is declining, thanks to the availability of free antiretroviral therapy, we are seeing more and more cases of CMV retinitis in non-HIV. Unlike our HIV counterparts, these are refractory to therapy and require more number of injections, and they progress to vasculopathy and ischemia with neovascularization. So this is something which we need to keep in mind when we follow up these patients. So the treatment is ganciclovir, intravenous ganciclovir, along with intravitreal injections of ganciclovir. So the dosages are available. Any antiviral therapy in all the forms usually require maintenance, and the recommended one is at least up to 6 months. This is a case, again, with treatment. And if you can see this arterial involvement, vasculopathy, and even though the retinitis has resolved, they need to be followed up for neovascularization. I just wanted to add this. There are lots of myths about acyclovir. Please do not give any test doses of acyclovir. This is one patient who had received test doses of acyclovir because these are all vesicants and they lead to subcutaneous extravasation, can cause extensive tissue necrosis and tissue damage. So this is something which we need to keep in mind. The pattern 4 is multifocal retinitis, generally seen as described by our previous speaker. Though they look so dangerous at presentation, they generally have a very good prognosis. The role of labs is supportive and PCR usually for atypical cases and monitoring of therapy, especially in ganciclovir resistant cases of CMV retinitis. So to conclude, viral retinitis is an ophthalmic emergency, and there is increased incidence in the era of HIV and iatrogenic immune suppression. The cornerstones of management is early identification by pattern recognition, prompt and aggressive treatment, and a multidisciplinary approach to manage the immune deficiency. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kalpana. That was really an extensive topic. I like that you put in the patterns. You just have to look at some of the patterns and that just hits you. If we can have maybe a quick comment from maybe Alay, because I know he sees a lot of viral retinitis, and then we'll go to the last talk and come back again to discussion.
Yeah, I'm glad that Kalpana touched about the aspect of using aggressive therapy. And I'm a big fan of using additional intravitreal antivirals along with the systemic antivirals. And I particularly use that a lot, and you get excellent results. Also, you try to save the retina as far as possible. So because we know most of these ARN cases ultimately end up in detachments because they have larger areas of necrotic retina. So I usually begin antiviral therapy right from day one, along with starting the systemic therapies.
So, Mashallah, there is a question in Q&A.
Yeah, we'll just take it in the end because we'll have Manisha take up the last talk of the session. I'm sure we'll have time because she'll be done in 10 minutes. So Dr. Manisha Agarwal is the current secretary of the Uveitis Society of India. She's a uveitis and retina expert from Delhi. And she's going to talk about a very interesting topic. So I don't want to miss that, COVID-related infectious uveitis lesions.
Good evening, everyone. And thank you, AIOS, Dr. Biswas and Somshila for organizing this interesting symposium on uveitis. In the coming 10 minutes, I would be speaking on the various COVID-related infectious uveitis lesions that we have all seen in our clinics. We all know that the ocular manifestations and COVID-19, basically the various manifestations have been secondary to either vascular, neuronal, inflammatory, or opportunistic infections. Now, out of all the manifestations which have been reported, I think the opportunistic infections have been the least reported in literature as of now. These can be triggered by the viral infection itself, and the mean age of presentation that has been reported is about 50 years of age. The median duration between the diagnosis of COVID and the ophthalmic symptoms has usually been 12 to 15 days, ranging between 4 to 55 days. So COVID-19 basically impacts the immune system of the patient and significantly decreases the CD4 counts. Now, we all know that corticosteroids is a life-saving drug in patients suffering from COVID-19, but it's like a double-edged sword. So it can further worsen the already compromised immune system of the patients suffering from COVID-19. Now, these are the various infectious uveitis lesions which have been reported, such as atypical ARN, retinitis lesions secondary to Candida and CMV, choroidal abscess, bacterial and fungal endogenous endophthalmitis. Now, this is a patient which has been reported with atypical ARN, and why it was atypical ARN? Because it had significant vitritis even in an immunosuppressed patient suffering from diffuse large B-cell lymphoma and on rituximab and chlorambucil. And what they have actually said is that probably the COVID-19, it breaks the blood-retinal barrier, and therefore the immune response can be increased in patients who are even immunosuppressed. So that's why it was like an atypical ARN presentation. Candida retinitis is something, another manifestation which has been reported, and this is a young 42-year-old diabetic hypertensive patient recovering from COVID-19 with a history of hospitalization and treated with tocilizumab and on ventilator for 3 weeks, and also given intravenous steroids. Typically, these patients presented with these multifocal retinitis lesions, And as you see, there's a very classical presentation of the vertical invasion of the Candida organism into the vitreous cavity, which is beautifully appreciated on the OCT images. Dr. Malika and Dr. Somshela, they have also reported very beautifully in their article the various manifestations of COVID-19, and they have also reported this 57-year-old male patient who was again recovering from COVID infection, having Candida septicemia and a renal infection, and had again multifocal retinitis lesions, treated again beautifully with intravenous and intravitreal voriconazole with a very good recovery of vision. Tubercular choroidal abscess is another case which has been reported by them, and this particularly a patient who showed this yellowish lesion with a lot of satellite lesions. And to their surprise also, they when treated this patient with ATT, it responded very well. And that is why they came to the diagnosis this probably was a tubercular abscess. There are also reports of reactivation of viral infections in patients suffering from COVID, and also having HIV positivity after 1 month of COVID infection. There is also reactivation of herpes simplex virus and CMV reactivation, which has been reported with manifestations as typical as a frosted branch meningitis. Now coming to infective endophthalmitis, so this is an indirect manifestation of COVID-19. It's found usually in seriously ill patients who are admitted in ICU with diabetes, with long-term IV lines, high dose of steroids, uncontrolled blood sugar levels, and last but not the least, treated with immunosuppressants. As we know that the patients already have low CD4 and CD8 counts, there could be a hematogenous spread of microorganisms from endogenous foci of infection. They could typically present with signs of endophthalmitis, which we all are aware of. And there have been reports of both bacterial and a fungal etiology. So this was a case series where they reported 4 cases. All of them were culture negative. They had subretinal abscess in all their 4 patients, but they possibly could not prove that this was a fungal infection, but they assumed that it was a fungal endogenous endophthalmitis because all the patients, they responded very well to the antifungal treatment. This is one of the patients which I have seen in my clinic, a 44-year-old male diabetic patient. Again, you see presented with fulminant endogenous endophthalmitis signs with pain, redness in the left eye for last 10 days. He had suffered from COVID 2 months back with hospitalization and IV steroids history. The vision was as low as counting finger close to face. We went ahead and we did a vitrectomy for this patient, and the sample showed Candida albicans, which the species that grew on the microbiological examination. This patient again responded very well to voriconazole, and the vision recovered to about 6/9 N9. This is a patient which has been shared to me by Dr. Ale, who is there in the session today. A patient, 61-year-old male patient who presented with diminution of vision and redness and pain in both eyes 1 month back. And for last 1 month, patient had suffered from COVID-19 3 months back and was hospitalized and treated with remdesivir and IVMP. Again, the vision was extremely low in the left eye. You see there were fulminant exudates in the vitreous cavity. This patient was treated with voriconazole and amphotericin B, and it grew a fungal infection by the name of bipolaris species, which is again a very rare fungal infection that we often don't see in our clinics. This is another report by Dr. Darius and his group where they have misdiagnosed, all the patients were misdiagnosed as non-infectious uveitis and treated with steroids by the primary treating ophthalmologist, and they ultimately turned out to be fungal endogenous endophthalmitis secondary to Candida and Aspergillus infections. This is another young, unfortunate 35-year-old female who presented to me with bilateral visual loss. She again was admitted for COVID 2 months back, and she presented with panophthalmitis in both the eyes. The vision was as low as plus minus perception of light in the left eye with no perception in the right eye. And it was a desperate situation. So I did go ahead and I did core vitrectomy for this patient. What was surprising was that 2 months later, also she continued having high levels of CRP, and her D dimer were also raised. Her blood cultures and urine cultures were all negative, and we really didn't know what we were dealing with. And just a few days back, we got the report that it was actually a Klebsiella pneumoniae infection. And if you see the sensitivity report, it was apparently resistant to most of the antibiotics that we had actually used while treating this patient. Coming to bacterial endogenous endophthalmitis, there are a few reports again in the literature. What is interesting is by this Italian group who have reported 4 patients, they have identified Klebsiella pneumoniae in one of the patients, which was again multi-drug resistant like our case. But they also detected the COVID-19 virus in the virus sample, but they were not sure if the endophthalmitis was secondary to the viral infection or it was because of the Klebsiella, which they also cultured in the urine and the blood culture samples of the patient. So I would just conclude my talk by saying that COVID-19 patients, they are immunosuppressed due to concomitant diseases like diabetes, use of high dose of steroids or immunosuppressants, leading to reactivation of latent infections or opportunistic infections, or a hematogenous spread of endogenous foci of infection to the eye. Ventilators, intravenous lines, or bottles of oxygen cylinders are potential sources of infections in these patients. These infectious uveitis implications have been a direct or an indirect implication of COVID-19 infection in these patients, and we all need to be aware of it and treat them, and not treat them as non-infectious uveitis, thereby treating with more and more of steroids and immunosuppressants. And I just want to highlight that recently we also issued on behalf of Uveitis Society of India an advisory to all the ophthalmologists who have been actually diagnosing these patients as non-infectious uveitis and treating them with steroids, which have actually led to the situation becoming worse in these patients. So this is something we all need to be aware of, that there is a lot of reactivation and opportunistic infections in these immunosuppressed patients that we are dealing in today's time in our clinics. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Manisha. You did finish well within time, as you said you would. So with that, we'll take a few questions. First of all, we'll answer the question in the Q&A. And this is from Dr. Preeti, who says, what are the indications of starting antiviral, in parenthesis CME, in suspected cases of POSS? I guess this question can be taken by anybody who is ready to take it up.
Kalpana?
So in Posner-Schlossman's, usually what happens is many times if you do not tap these patients at the right time and the pressures are high, there is a nice paper, I think, by Dr. Rutova's group, where they've looked at what are the factors which would aid, give a higher positivity of PCR. One is pigmented KPs, and if you have high pressures at the time of tapping. So many times you may require more than one tap to really diagnose a CMV-related uveitis. So if it is, probably in these cases, what you could do is you can give a local form, a topical form of Valgan cyclovir, and follow up these patients with specular and Pachy. And if you feel that the counts are dropping, then maybe we need to give them systemic therapy.
I hope that answers this question. We have one more question, which is in our chat box, not in the Q&A. Actually, 2 questions there. One of them is, I think Dr. Vishali would be the best person to answer. And it's from Dr. Alok Sen. So in ocular tuberculosis, is there a correlation between IGRA values or TST and response to treatment, especially recurrence?
I replied to him personally. We did study the correlation between molecules and quantiferon, like we used to quantify quantiferon like crazy people, but it did not show any correlation. Now, regarding the treatment response, the pulmonologists don't really follow these tests for treatment. So we have never done it. We have not really repeated to monitor response. We just see clinically because we can see the pathology. So I don't need a test to tell me whether my patient is responding.
Actually, I'll just add one. We had a paper some time back on, we looked at the quantiferon after treatment after a year, and there was a significant drop in the value. But I mean, there were patients who were still, borderline, but when you look at that drop in the value, that was significant, I think, after a year.
That's very useful. We'll come back to the topic of syphilis and syphilitic uveitis. So the question is open to all speakers and panelists and chairs if they would like to add further. So as Dr. JB, you have to unmute yourself. As somebody said that in the past we would investigate all patients.
Any of us do a syphilis test in serpiginous choroiditis where there's a classic picture? I don't do that. When I make a clinical diagnosis or a VKH where there is a clinical diagnosis, is quite obvious.
So the reverse question is that when do we test for syphilis? What are the indications that we test for?
But syphilis is a one-time disease. So once you get the disease, when treated, it doesn't come back.
It's my humble request to all the doctors that I guess it's a wrap for the session. I request you to please sum up within the 30 seconds, please.
All right. So we have 30 seconds. If anybody would like to chip in with one comment, who is not
I
speaking.
used to do it for all my patients. It comes positive. Even for those whom I wanted to come positive, somehow you have to keep repeating it. So I guess there are no standard guidelines. But if something doesn't seem right and not on your face, like if it's not VKH or if it's not VKH, I will invariably do it.
I think in infectious uveitis, it's probably more important to investigate, to get a concrete evidence of what the infection can be, because many of them can masquerade each other. You can have viral.
These uveitis patients where you don't know what's happening, I would do it.
Yeah. So that is the message. And I'd like to thank all the speakers. I'd like to thank the chair, co-chair, conveners, and my co-moderator as well. Everybody's talks were just brilliant, and thank you so much for sticking to time.
Thank you so much, our respected chairpersons and moderators, for just an amazing enlightening session. For now, we conclude for today, and we stop with the Kelman Hall. Thank you so much for participating in AIOC. Thank you so much.
Thanks to the tech team also.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Good night.